We're here today to say to an American government, hands off Zimbabwe. Lift the sanctions. What they do to Zimbabwe, they will do to us in Harlem and in Bed-Stuy and in East New York. The president of Zimbabwe will be speaking at the United Nations. So we're having this a rally in support of the December 12th movement. And we're saying that Mugabe was right. The president that is in office now is correct. ZANU-PF is correct. They took the land back from the colonists who stole it from them in the first place, and now Zimbabwe has been liberated, but the liberation process continues. They're taking the mining industry back. That's what all African leaders should do. So until Africa is liberated and Zimbabwe is liberated, African people in America and the rest of the diaspora will not be liberated. So that's why we're out here today, to make that connection. If you're disrespecting Africans in Zimbabwe, you have disrespected Africans in the diaspora here in Harlem, Brooklyn, Bed-Stuy, and other places. Hands off Zimbabwe, lift the sanctions.
We're here today in support of the organization, December 12th, and all of those who have called for this public display of support. We're talking about having an independent, sovereign nation be able to determine what it is that they're going to have existing in their own country. They are certainly entitled to reclaim what it is that was theirs, that was stolen and taken from them. We know that those who are capitalists have their greedy eyes looking to see how it is that they can grab what it is that does not belong to them, that exploits the people and the industries that exist. But we're saying lift the sanctions. We're one people, and we're here in Harlem supporting what's going on in Zimbabwe. And we think that the President Mnangagwa is going to continue to do the work of restoration for the people of Zimbabwe.
How y'all feel? How we feel? Zimbabwe lives! Zimbabwe lives! Zimbabwe lives! Zimbabwe lives! The enemies of Zimbabwe are the enemies of Harlem. The enemies of Harlem are the enemies of Zimbabwe. From Harlem to Zimbabwe.
African people standing up.
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 Zimbabwe. 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 Zimbabwe is standing up for African peoples, brothers and sisters. We came here today, first and foremost, to welcome the new president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson D. Mnangagwa, to the United Nations. He comes representing the people of Zimbabwe, who we know very well. Because when Africa called, Zimbabwe answered. When Africa called, Zimbabwe answered. On the question of the Congo, it was Zimbabwe that stood up. On the question of the AU, it was Zimbabwe that has stood up. It is Zimbabwe that has said self-determination is more important than anything. Black power, is a human right.
It's a human right.
African power,
African power
is a human right.
is a human right.
So we say Zimbabwe lives.
Yeah,
Zimbabwe lives.
yeah.
Zimbabwe lives.
Yeah.
Zimbabwe lives.
Yeah.
Zimbabwe lives.
Yeah.
We remember the African liberation struggles. The struggles to seize political power and put it in the hands of the people. But as our brother Osei-Kwame Kwame Nkrumah said, we seek first political power. But political power without economic power cannot stand. And so Zimbabwe did what has never been done in Africa for a colonized people. It liberated the land, the most important resource. And we know that right here in Harlem, right? We feel that right here in Harlem, right? If you don't have land, if you don't have a place to stand and to build your culture, to build your economy, to teach your children to defend your human rights, then you will fail. So Zimbabwe has taken a leadership position in pointing the direction for Africa to be self-determining, to defend themselves, and to declare we're one African people. Zimbabwe lives! Zimbabwe lives! Zimbabwe lives! Zimbabwe lives! And many of the people here have had the opportunity to travel to the motherland straight ahead. And many of our people have had the opportunity to go to Zimbabwe, to be on the ground, on the land. And there's nothing in the world like free African land.
Zimbabwe is. Zimbabwe is. Zimbabwe is.
Afternoon. That was a clip from a demonstration that was Saturday, I believe, on the sanctions in Zimbabwe. President Emerson D. Mnangagwa, I can say it
Close.
right, I can't say it fast, will be speaking at the UN tomorrow. And your president spoke at the UN today, and the subject is sanctions. Now, I had a few speakers there, and there was one speaker who spoke twice that I did not show, simply because I have that gentleman in the studio. It is my immense pleasure to welcome the recalcitrant, dynamic activist, Raja Wareham of the December 12th movement, that's a capital M, capital O, to 30 Frames once again.
Thank you, my honor.
Bring the audience up to speed as what's going on and what the focus will be when...
Okay. What's going on is what was set out in the clip that you just played in terms of really what Malcolm taught us, what Garvey taught us, what Kwame Ture taught us of the importance of Africa to our existence in the United States. And that's something that has got to be a continual lesson to black folks who are resident in the United States, because we've been, those of us who were brought up in this country, we're taught to despise Africa, we're taught to deny any connection to Africa, we're taught that Africa was negative and that everything about it was bad. And on the contrary, those leaders who came forward in the 20th century in particular, who understood that, first of all, before the term globalization became popular, they understood that it was a global world, and they understood that the black folks in the United States and black folks in the diaspora were intimately and intrinsically connected to Africa. And so, I think it was either Charles Barron or Molly said, until Africans are free, Africa is free, Africans, those of us in the diaspora, can't be free. So that's what this was. That's what this whole thing was about. Zimbabwe, in particular, is very important because, as was said, Zimbabwe took a step that no other African country had. They had all achieved some form of political independence. They had a flag, they had a parliament or a Congress or whatever they call it. They had a court system, and some of them still wear wigs,
right.
For colonial hangovers. But they did not have control of their economy. And if you look at what's happening in South Africa today, the whole motion around a constitutional amendment to authorize the taking of land without compensation to the whites who stole it 100 or more years ago, and bringing it back to the people who actually were from there, that's a reflection of what's happening, of this struggle to achieve control of the economy, achieve control of your economic development, of your country's development, because it does not behoove you to have a flag in a court, but you can't sustain yourself. And so Zimbabwe became the point when then President Robert Mugabe in 1999, who until that point in time had been considered by white folks the model of African democracy,
right.
because they had had a liberation struggle, an armed struggle that had been finally ended with a formal agreement in the UK called the Lancaster Agreement, whereby the liberation forces agreed to basically have not a dispensation, an agreement where the whites who were there would have a certain number of people in their parliament for a certain number of years, and then that there would be an agreement they called willing buyer, willing seller, that they would sell back the land that they had stolen.
Right. This was in 68,
This
69?
this was in 1979. 1979.
Okay.
And that only happened because they were at the point where the liberation movement was getting ready to take the capital, which was then called Salisbury,
right.
by force.
Right.
But what the Rhodesians...
The armed struggle started around 68.
Around 67, 68,
Yeah,
right.
okay.
Right.
Okay.
But what had happened was the Rhodesians, the white Rhodesians, well, they're all the white Rhodesians in South Africa, were then bombing the surrounding countries that were providing support to the liberation movement, in particular Zambia, which became so intense and so many civilians were being killed that the support countries, the front line countries they call them, prevailed upon the Zimbabwean liberation forces to sit down and work out this agreement. When it came time to do willing seller, willing buyer, the sellers weren't willing. Surprise. The sellers weren't willing, and the agreement that had been made when the Lancaster Agreement was signed was that Britain and the U.S., and the U.S. didn't have any nickel in this, but they were, the kith and kin, the white folks across the Atlantic kith and kin, so they signed on to it, and they said that they would provide the money to pay the so-called willing sellers, the whites, to give up their land. When it came time for that, the president at the time said, well, that was agreed to by another president, and the British Prime Minister at the time said, well, that was agreed to by another Prime Minister, as if these weren't agreements between states. These were like individual agreements, like shake my hand, I'll give you, I got you. And so they didn't do it. The people who had fought the war said, you know what, it's nice that we have a parliament, but we didn't fight this war. We didn't give up our lives. We didn't suffer torture so that we could have a parliament. We did this for the land. And they began a movement to expropriate the land. And President Mugabe, who was the head of the government at the time, said, we're going to formalize this. And they started what was called a land reform program. So it was like almost overnight. President Mugabe, who had been lauded as the Abraham Lincoln or George Washington of the African continent, then became Hitler. He became the Black Hitler, like overnight. Yeah. Because
which is an oxymoron, Black Hitler. But
because now they upset the apple cart. The apple cart being that white folks thought that they could disappear in a physical sense, but still maintain control.
Right.
And so Zimbabwe was the first step on that. And so since that time, and then once that happened, the British imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. But more importantly, the United States imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. The United States put forward a bill called the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001. Jesse Helms, who most black people know, unless you're really young, who was like the idol of racists politicians. Jesse Helms died in the wool, racist.
Right, the old Jabba the Hutt.
That's right, the old time, old time racist. Jesse Helms, and co-sponsored by Hillary Clinton, who was in the Senate, and she was a co-sponsor of this act. And the objective of the act, on its face, what it said was, we just want to make sure that human rights are respected and that elections are free and fair in Zimbabwe. And once that has been established, the president can end the sanctions. The sanctions they imposed were not only bilateral sanctions between the United States and Zimbabwe, but every international funding institution that the United States had influence on, which means the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or any other funds, the United States used this influence to knock them out from getting any kind of funding. So from 2001 till this day, Zimbabwe has been struggling to survive without getting any help from the Western international institutions. The objective, I mean, the stuff around human rights and, excuse me, in elections, that was a fig leaf. That was not what they wanted to create was a situation that would lead the people to overthrow the government. It's what they called, what Kissinger called back in 1973 when they overthrew the government in Chile. They said, we're going to make the economy scream.
Right.
And when the economy screams, the question is then where do the people look for, what's the cause of this?
Right.
And in Chile, the army came in and overthrew and killed Allende.
Right.
And then the aid started flowing, immediately in terms of that. So they tried to do the same thing in Zimbabwe. The difference was that President Mugabe and his party, ZANU-PF, had deep roots with the people.
Right.
And Zimbabwe is mainly an agricultural country. And and ZANU's roots were with that. So even though the sanctions imposed tremendous hardships and it almost caused the economy completely to collapse, because at one time the Zimbabwe currency was worth so little.
Right.
It was like you have wheelbarrows. What they're talking about in Venezuela right now.
Right.
You need wheelbarrows in terms of currency to just buy a bottle of water, because the currency had been so devalued, the economy had been so attacked.
Correct.
So that was one front that they were doing in terms of trying to undermine Zimbabwe and trying to reverse, because remember, all this is about reversing the land reform program. The other thing they did was to establish an opposition party. This was called the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, which was established in 1999. As soon as this land reform program became active, they established this land reform, it's called the MDC, by the old Rhodesians, the old Rhodesian landowners. They set it up with financing from Britain. They got themselves a black person to front it, which his name was Morgan Shangarai. He was a union activist, and they became the opposition. And they got a lot of money from the West. A lot of money went to NGOs, non-governmental organizations in Zimbabwe that were part of this opposition. So for the first 10 years, this went back and forth in terms of the elections, and we were there. We would monitor elections. Okay. We'd be part of that whole process.
Now don't go so fast because I have a little knowledge, but I don't want you to go so fast that our
listeners get lost.
Our viewers actually don't pick up on what you're saying, because what you're saying is paramount to understanding what's going on and figuring out how we can do something about it.
Zimbabwe had regular, quote-unquote, democratic elections every 5 years from the time of independence. And ZANU won resoundingly in almost all those elections.
Now ZANU is
the part of Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, ZANU-PF.
Correct.
ZANU-PF was a unification of the two liberation movements that fought the War of Independence.
Right.
That they were the two organizations conducting armed struggle.
The current president, because there's a lot of talk about the current president trying to devalue him as a legitimate president. But he actually met Mugabe in like '68 or so. He was in the Black Liberation part of ZANU at that time.
President Mnangagwa was fought in the liberation struggle. He fought with He was with President Mugabe. I mean, who eventually became President Mugabe. All the way through. So he was a combatant. And he was in one of the areas he was in charge of was intelligence. So he had all of the credentials of having fought in the war and having been a loyal member of ZANU-PF.
He goes a long way back.
And once the war ended, the two liberation movements came together and formed ZANU-PF for the administration of the government. So when I say ZANU-PF, it's the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front. And so from the time elections first happened in 1980 through today, there were regular elections in Zimbabwe. At several of them, we were there as monitors, and we'd go out in the countryside, and see how people were being organized and seeing how elections were conducted. What developed in terms of any kind of base for the opposition in terms of MDC was that one of the things that ZANU-PF did when they first came to power was to deal with the question of literacy. The Rhodesians had done little to nothing in terms of education for the indigenous people. And so they had a high rate of illiteracy. I'm not even sure if it was like 80-something% of illiteracy. And so
just like Venezuela.
Right. Well, I don't know what Venezuela's illiteracy rate was.
I'm not comparing the rate of illiteracy,
but the focus
was
on
very, very high, and that was what the focus was when Chavez came in.
How do you change the quality of life for people's first that they're literate? And so whatever funding and income and gross national product that Zimbabwe had in its early years was directed towards literacy, health, and those things that improve the quality of life of people, electrification.
Right.
And at a certain point, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund said, well, you know what, you can't do that. You've got to focus on creating more of a profit and not putting things into social services. And main thing you gotta do is pay back our loans.
Right.
And they called it structural adjustment. So that then if you didn't change the focus and privatize the different industries, then they would say, well, you're not going to get any more loans. So it was a way that the Western former colonial countries could maintain control over the colonies who had political independence. But this was their
slogans.
This was their form. This was their form of maintaining economic control.
Right.
And so when that happens, then you get a resistance. If you do that, then you get a resistance from people because now they're losing the safety net, they're losing the social services.
Right.
So all this is going on.
Right.
And then once the land reform program kicks in, and then the sanctions that happen, then there's no real income coming. There's nothing being produced. And I mean, there is things being produced because it's an agricultural country, but they're able to produce enough to sustain themselves, but not enough for export. Zimbabwe has some of the best beef in the world.
Correct.
A lot of other countries, Australia, take Zimbabwean beef and market it as it's their own. I'm not a smoker or a fan of tobacco, but the strain of Zimbabwe's tobacco is supposed to be the best in the world. So a lot of those companies, British companies.
Okay, beef, tobacco, what else?
Horticulture.
Okay.
They export flowers, from all over the world. And then they have mineral resources. People think of South Africa, the country South Africa, and they think of diamonds, gold, platinum. That whole area of Southern Africa. It's only South Africa is just delineated because of the Berlin Conference. They cut out and said this part is South Africa. But that whole area.
So they got meat, they got agriculture, they got horticulture, they got
all sorts of natural minerals. Diamonds, platinum. All sorts of resources. So it's a paradise in that sense. The question always is who controls who gets the benefit from those resources.
Correct.
So once the sanctions kicked in and the currency went out of control and the inflation was sky high, there was an election in 2008 where, I mean, people were the conditions were getting worse, particularly in the cities. Zimbabwe had educated so many, all education was free right through at least high school, and then in some areas in university. So you had a lot of people who graduated with degrees. There was no work for them, and they became the fertile ground for the opposition. That the problem isn't that the sanctions are crippling our economy. The problem is that ZANU-PF is mismanaging the economy. That's
the spin. That's always the spin. One of the things that places like Cuba and Venezuela, Zimbabwe, all of them have one thing in common. They are all countries that have been colonized by Europeans at one time. And European nations are reluctant to give up their hard-earned golden goose.
Hard-earned, right.
I mean, we took it fair and square.
We stole it fair and square.
Well, they actually believe, and I'm sorry you missed the president's speech, but because he can be quite blunt, but if you listen in between the lines, he's very honest. And he's talking about hegemony. And he's talking about even beyond economic ideology, he's talking like the pecking order of white supremacy.
He's at the top of the chart.
He really is.
And there's only one top.
There's only one top. There's only one top. It is white supremacy. They always have a spin that they are not bringing sanctions against the people. They are bringing sanctions against the corrupt leadership. But the intent is to break the back of the people, so that the people will then kill the leadership, and give them back all the resources. It's also interested in the case of Zimbabwe specifically, that they're always talking about how unfair it is that they need to do these sanctions because you are murdering and taking land from the poor, defenseless white people. But there is not even a little bit of compassion for, say, the Palestinians, who are getting like piss thrown on the top of their heads in Hebron. So they always have this spin. But the intention is always to break the backs of the people, break the spirit of the people through economic hegemony. Usually they cut off avenues of food and medicine. That seems to be the case most of the time, which ultimately, if you have to get these things, you have to deal with the black market, which destroys your economy. So this is it's not nuanced, because they keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again.
Because they think it works for them. I mean,
right.
They think it works for them. So yeah, and they came closest in 2008. When there was a 2008 national election, that's when they came closest to achieving their goals. The West came closest to achieving their goals, because in the election for president, neither President Mugabe nor Shangirai got a majority, and you had to have at least 50% plus one vote to win. And so what finally came out of that, there was another election, and President Mugabe won, and they formed a government of national unity. Which meant that now MDC was in the government. President Mugabe was the president, Shangirai was prime minister, and they got cabinet posts. So for the next 5 years, they participated in it. And it became very clear during that period of time that all they were interested in was get a Mercedes-Benz to chauffeur them, have a title with them, and whatever sort of perks they could rip off, so that they were not interested in governing.
Right.
They were not interested in governing. And like I said, their base was young people in the city, in the urban areas, like in Harare or Bulawayo.
Right.
And they call them, these were the ones they called the born frees. These are the ones who were born after the liberation struggle, but got the benefits of that when the whole education process was going through. And were affected by Western influences, just like our children here, right?
Know, Cardi B,
Around, this is the kind of life not only is possible, but I deserve.
Yeah, right.
And if you can't provide that for me, then it's not. It must be you.
It must be you. It must be you.
So in that period of 2008 to 2013, between those elections, what it did do was expose that MTV wasn't serious about governing.
Right.
And ZANU-PF summed up the mistakes that it had made and how it had to tighten up and did that, and then started what they instituted a policy called Looking East, that since they were being blocked by the West from getting any type of investment, they started looking to China, India, Russia, with the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, for investment. And one of the things they found was that
I don't know if you can count India anymore, because India has kind of moved over to the other side.
Right, but at that point in time, they were getting aid from India, and that it did not come. Their help, the aid from those countries, did not come with all the restrictions that Western aid came with. Because if you got aid from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or the United States, they would tell you what you had to do with it. You'd have to use their equipment, you'd have to use their replacements, and you'd have to use their technicians who were getting paid for it. And at any point in time, they would pull it back if you weren't, if you weren't politically supporting them.
And the
they would jerk
interest was gangster. It was beyond usury. It was just gangster.
It was right. And so they started looking east, and China made investment. China was investing in the infrastructure and developing the infrastructure, and in training their people, in training indigenous Zimbabweans to work the different buildings and manufacturing and machinery that was being done. So in that sense, they were able to mitigate some of the effects of the sanctions. So, which brings us to the last year, when within ZANU-PF there was a turmoil around, in terms of President Mugabe, who at that point was like 92 or 93 years old, whose wife, who had not fought in the liberation struggle, his second wife.
I'm going to ask about his wife, because there's something going on with her.
Had a lot of ambition. She was very ambitious.
What's the name of or something 40?
What do they call them? The 40.
The M something 40 or something 40.
Yeah, but they were younger folks. That's
younger folks is what
who were trying to really.
She's in her 50s now, so I don't know how she fits into that.
Get rid of all of the older folks, the older veterans, the old guard who had fought the war. And
at least that's their brand.
And to replace them with really what represented like the MDC opposition in terms of what they saw needed to happen. And so it was in that context that when now President Mnangagwa who was vice president was basically fired, that ZANU-PF summed up, you know what, there's too much going on here, we got to put a stop to this. And they did, and they'd asked President Mugabe to resign, which he eventually did. And when President Mnangagwa took over, he said, I mean, he said one thing that was very important. He said, the land reform program is irreversible.
Right.
We're not backing up off this. So if
Right.
you thought that whatever our disagreements
Right,
were,
right.
they
That
weren't
was the-
around that.
That
the
was
land,
the kicker.
the land reform program is irreversible.
Right.
And he put forward what they call a new dispensation in terms of we're in economic turmoil, and then how do we counter that? One of the things they did after 2008 was they basically gave up their currency, and so the currencies for exchange were U.S. dollar, South African rand, and now they're using the Chinese yuan.
Right.
So those are the, and they have something. They have a sort of hybrid bond currency that they're doing now, but it stabilized the economy.
Right.
And so what President Mnangagwa is saying is that his mantra is Zimbabwe is open for investment.
Right.
And he's taken that
Open for
around
business,
open for business, right?
Right.
He's taken that around the world in terms of getting investment to stimulate the economy, to get the infrastructure built, so that they can not only mine diamonds, but then process them and cut them and put them on the market.
Correct.
So that they have a vertical.
Correct.
So they can do it from one end to the other, as opposed to sending it to Israel or South Africa or Belgium to cut the diamonds.
Ooh, Lord have mercy. You just came right out and named the top 3 culprits in this
Well,
thing.
they're the ones who do that. And so that's what's been the push, and it's going around. Like I say, he's from the time he was appointed in November, and from that time through now, that's been the mantra in terms of, and they've gotten a number of commitments from companies. And so one of the conundrums that Trump faces, but that doesn't mean anything, is that other countries are now prepared to invest where other countries and other companies, whereas U.S. companies can't do that because they'll be violating the sanctions.
Right.
And they're it's like with Cuba in one sense. They're sort of chomping at the bit. They want to be part of it.
Right.
So
Right.
what we've done, we, the December 12th movement, have fought for from the time the sanctions were imposed, was to end the sanctions.
Right.
Because although the sanctions ostensibly are supposed to affect the leadership, that doesn't happen. They can't travel certain places. But what it really affects is the economy of the country. It affects the people at the base.
Yeah.
They're the ones that really suffer that. And right from Bush through Obama through Trump, every year, each of those presidents signed a thing to renew it. We had a campaign when Obama was president, said, called with a stroke of a pen. With the stroke of a pen, he could end that, because that's what the law provides.
Correct.
And then the other lesson from that is the Congressional Black Caucus, which has taken up the position of the United States, basically. For those who remember, when the Black Caucus came together, it was within the context of the Black Liberation Movement and the Black Power Movement and the Civil Rights struggle. And they were supposed to come in office to represent the interests of black folks, because those are the communities where they were elected from. And they have not done that in any real, consistent, positive way. Different individuals at different points in time take positions, but around the Zimbabwe question, they have backed the U.S. government from Jump Street.
Dr. Jeffries always talks about analysis. That we have to be far more adept at analyzing what's going down and the personalities and the limitations of the people that we deal with, and not simply on the analyzing those people who are most aggressive to us, but we have to analyze those people who're supposed to be on our side a little better. All of the people that you mentioned, Obama, the Black Caucus, are politicians, and there is a weakness in them that will never ever permit them to do what is necessary to liberate black people and open up opportunity for black people because they work in tandem with white supremacy. This is their bread. This is where their bread is buttered.
Right. And they don't. It reminds me of one time. Your viewers may remember Judge Bruce Wright.
Yeah.
You know, a black judge who took the position that black people aren't criminals, and they're entitled to the benefit of the Constitution, just like white folks are.
Right.
And he came under fire because when people came up to him for bail, he'd said bail that people could make.
Right.
Other judges said bail that they knew that people could make. So basically, it was asking for ransom. And so people end up staying in jail simply because they were
committed
poor.
to slavery. Right.
And bail is only supposed to ensure that you come back to court.
Correct.
It's not a punishment.
Correct.
And so one time I said to him, this was I think even before I was in law school, I said, Judge, well, what's going to happen if they fire you? He said, I made a living before I was a judge.
Right.
I made a living before I was a lawyer. Right. So he was not tied to, I got to have this job at any cost. Too many of our politicians are tied to, oh shoot, if I blow this, I'll have to go work. So you don't have.
I don't even think it's the money. I think it's the proximity, the honorary whiteness of the thing that they fear most. Because I see dudes who are like rich beyond ever needing anything from anybody, if I had just a little bit, it'd be like kiss my butt, but it's the proximity to white power and that they love most, that they can't. I mean, Charlie Rangel, he cried like a baby when they caught him in the Dominican Republic with his shoes off. He also, when Hugo Chavez was alive, he came to the United States and he said, "I can smell the brimstone" or something. The sulfur, it was Charlie Rangel that was like, got in a huff. How dare he speak that way of our president, our president, And I don't fault them as much as I fault us for not being able to see them as they are and adjust our strategy accordingly, because they're not going to change.
Right. You don't get too many like the barons who are willing to take a correct position, even if it's unpopular. And so the Congressional Black Caucus supported the ZDERA, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, when it first started, supported it all the way through. And what's even worse, this past year, Congress passed an amendment to the Zimbabwe Democracy Economic Recovery Act, to ZDERA. And the amendment didn't lessen it, it made it worse. Because the amendment, because now we're in a period where there's a new president, he's as far as anybody can see, he's adhering to, what they say is democracy. He's encouraging transparency. He's encouraging the participation of the opposition parties in the whole process. And they propose, and they pass an amendment that says not only the other restrictions we had in it, but before we end this law, before we call off the sanctions, you're going to have to make provision to reimburse the white folks whose land you took for that. Which wasn't even in the original one.
Which is insane.
And they passed it, and Trump signed it.
Which is insane.
Trump signed it.
It's like the Haiti thing where they're paying reparations for being enslaved.
For 200 years,
It's awesome. It's awesome.
And so this election came up on July 30th. And this was supposed to be the test in terms of whether Mnangagwa was serious about a free and fair election, because the West maintains the other ones weren't, even though the record says that they were, but be that as it may, Mnangagwa said transparency, participation. There were like 22 people running for president. There were a number of opposition groups. We were there. I was a monitor at the election. And to see how the election was conducted there and to see how elections are conducted here, Zimbabwe had it hands
Oh,
down.
of course, of course.
We went to a spot before the election started. People were lined up. They had made provision for people who have children, who are pregnant, who may have a disability, any sort of impediment, that they would either go to the front of the line or they had another spot for them to go so that they would not be tied up waiting. They had a ballot box. I mean, it's not electronic. It's like old-fashioned. Big plastic box, sealed on top, sealed with a lock. People got their ballots. They marked them. They dropped it in the box. Everybody could see. There was one brother who had made a mistake on his ballot, and he had to get another ballot. But all of the opposition, all of the parties who were in the election were there, and everybody could participate in what was happening. And once they saw what the problem was, everybody agreed, so it was not a question of him getting another, but the first ballot was destroyed. There was a record made of that. And as I said, the people were there from all the opposition parties.
Right.
And so that's how it was conducted, you know. And at the end of the day, because this box was like sealed. Matter of fact, one place we went to when they were first locking the box, the lock didn't work. They said the lock was too small or something. They had to call to Central to let them know that the lock didn't work. They didn't need to bring new locks. Everybody participated. They could see what was happening. In the meantime, they sealed the box around the sides so it couldn't be opened until the lock came. And so at the end of the day, all of the accredited people who were there counted the votes. They didn't send them someplace. They counted the votes right there. Once the count started, nobody could leave.
Right.
Everybody had to turn off their phones.
Right.
Nobody's making any calls until the votes were counted.
Right.
And once the votes were counted, there was a form that each party signed saying this was a vote count.
Right.
And then those results were sent to the Central and along with the box, but relock the box. So what happened was the opposition was led by Morgan Shangra had died earlier that year. So the opposition was led by a young lawyer named Nelson Chamisa, who was in a way he's like Trump, but he's young, he's charismatic, and they juxtapose him with Mnangagwa, who's 75, but still very not really charismatic like that, but still very energetic. Right. But his
not like Trump.
His appeal
71 going on 98.
His appeal was to these young folks unemployed in the city. And what he said was, and he made a bunch of outrageous statements during this election campaign, but what he said was that this was the day before the election started. He said, "I've won this election. If I don't win this election, the election was rigged."
The election was rigged.
Which sounds very Trumpish, right? Because that's what he said. But what it did was it created in people's minds that there's a fix going on. And so when the results came in and he lost, and when the results came in and his party lost, there were 2/3 of the Congress was taken by ZANU-PF. And then he lost the presidential election. The president had 50%. He had 44%. He said,
50.8 or something, like over 50.
Over 50%. He said, I won this election. And what they did the next day was to try to create a situation to provoke the government to respond to them. And some people probably, because it was all over the news, that the next day, the day after the election, a bunch of young people who had been, they provided them with alcohol, whatever. The downtown Harare started attacking and burning up stuff in downtown Harare.
I'm glad you, I shouldn't have cut you off. Keep going.
In downtown Harare, and anybody knows in any city, any government, nobody's going to let a bunch of folks tear up their downtown area. And so the police responded. And because the police had been dispersed all over the country to deal with the election, they eventually had to call in the army as well to put it down. And so in that process, 6 people got shot, I think, or 7 people got shot. to this day, it's not clear who did it. But what happened was that the opposition then said, well, because the police used tear gas and shot people, then the election was not legitimate. So, like, the election was 2 days before that. What did the police response to a provocation have to do with that the election wasn't legitimate? Because they wanted to confuse the whole thing. And the Western president said,
No,
that's what it was,
none
a
of this
distraction.
is new.
The Western president said, oh, well, and let me just say, there were monitors from all over. The Republican Institute had a monitor there. The Democratic Foundation had a monitor there. The EU had monitors. Norway had, there were monitors from all over the world.
Right.
And at the point when the election ended, some said, well, there might have been a little, but overall, the elections were free and fair. So there was no question that the vote count was legitimate and that ZANU-PF had won, fair and square.
Right.
So now it becomes a question of, and how do you muddy the waters? How do you cloud it up to because your objective, if your objective is to delegitimize the government and take over any way you can, then you do that. So that's what happened. And so they made all sorts of allegations around vote fixing. People said, but wait a second, your people were at these polling places, they signed the forms, and if they didn't sign the forms, it was because they chose not to, but not because there was any objection. When the votes were being counted, your people were there, and they never said anything about this is improper. But then, after everything's done, that's when they say that. And they waited till the last minute, they filed a court case. The court said, you don't have a case because you can't prove what you're saying. There's nothing that contradicts the fact that the vote was conducted properly and the people of Zimbabwe chose who they wanted to rule.
You were in Zimbabwe. I actually went to and videotaped the elections in Venezuela. And Venezuela uses techniques that require like fingerprints, much like your telephone. And it was obvious that the majority of the people were going to vote for Maduro. So it wasn't about the elections. It wasn't about the legitimacy of the elections. In point of fact, the violence, and Venezuela does not even allow you to buy or consume alcohol on election day. You know, no violence came from Maduro. You know, the Chavistas. They had the people. They had the vote. They had the numbers. It wasn't necessary. But this is not about elections.
No.
This is about maintaining colonial control over black and brown nations all over the world. This is about European hegemony. And they use this economics for that. One of the upsides of Trump, and it's hard to find one.
Low bar.
Right. But one, his upside is that he's so truculent that he tells you exactly how he feels about the thing. You can't, it's not like the Congressional Black Caucus. You can't misread him. You can misread Hillary. You can misread Barack Obama. You can't misread Trump. And the things that he has said and done is gangster. And the upside is that he is making it obvious that he wants to enforce the Monroe Doctrine on all of the world. He wants to control trade.
Manifest destiny.
Right, manifest destiny. And he's not going to change, and his cabal is not going to change, which means that countries that are so rich in resources, that are being squeezed, are going to have to find ways to circumvent the Europeans and form trading partnerships. That this is really war. That there's no confusing.
It's war, right?
You know, there's no confusing. They're not going to change. They're not going to accommodate. They're doubling down on the sanctions. They're not even like, kissing you, you know, or lying to you. What do you see? You have a thought, and I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I have a thought. Just because I know we're running out of time. Because the question always becomes when we do these analysis, okay, so then what are we going to do?
Right.
For black folks here, we need to have Zimbabwe's back, which means we need to speak to our elected officials around ending the sanctions. That's got to be your call to your congressperson, your state your senator, congressional senator, around ending the sanctions. So call them, email them, go by their office. So that's got to be one thing around getting other people that you know to call them and say the sanctions have got to end. That's one thing. Tomorrow, on Wednesday, President Mnangagwa is speaking at the UN. And so we're going to have a support rally for him outside the UN. So if you're free tomorrow, rain or shine, 3 p.m. at 47th Street and First Avenue, Doug Hammarskjöld, you have to come in at 47th Street and 2nd Avenue. And then we're going to be down at the front of the line at 47th Street and First Avenue at 3 p.m. So anybody who can come, please do that. If you need more information, you can call 718-398-1766. That's 718-398-1766, which is the phone number at Sisters Place, headquarters of the December 12th movement. So the sanctions, come to the demo tomorrow. Black Solidarity Day, the first Monday in November, we're going to be looking at that whole issue of Zimbabwe, sanctions, what the forms black people are under attack in the United States right now, and the 2020 census, which is coming up, where we're going, they're erasing us. They're erasing us out of it. 2020 census is very important in terms of what statistically they're going to do to erase us. So we're going to pull all that together on Black Solidarity Day. People should call us about that in terms of where it's going to be, whether we're going to do it at Sisters Place or someplace else. But that's very important. It's always got to be, our struggle is not to observe the world, but to change it. Because this program is very important because it provides the information that we need, the ammunition in our mind that we need to understand what's going on, to be able to see where the weak points are, what are the places we need to attack to push forward our struggle to ensure our survival throughout the rest of this century, because it's not guaranteed. We should not take it for granted.
Right. We will see you next week. As Zimbabwe goes, so goes Harlem, so goes East New York, so goes Bed-Stuy. So the struggle is everywhere for all of us. Peace. We are out. I'll see you next week. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you, bro. You were worried that I wasn't going to get.
From Harlem to Zimbabwe,
African people standing up.
from Harlem to Zimbabwe,
African people standing up.
from Harlem to Zimbabwe.
African people standing up.
So never give up.
Never give up.
So never give up.
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 So never give up.
Never give up.
Because we are an African people. 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 From Harlem to Zimbabwe.
African people standing up.
From Harlem to Zimbabwe.
African people standing up.
From Harlem to Zimbabwe.
African people standing up.